Empires don't unravel when they are weak. They unravel when they are strong, confident, and convinced that whatever worked yesterday will work forever. America didn't begin to struggle at the moment it lost power. It began to struggle at the moment it believed power had made adaptation optional. For most of its history, the United States saw itself as the exception to every historical rule. Rome collapsed because it was ancient. Britain declined because it overextended. The Soviet Union fell because it was inefficient and authoritarian. America, the story went, was different, more innovative, more flexible, more self-correcting. A system designed not just to survive history, but to outrun it. China watched this confidence with a sense of familiarity, not because China was weaker, but because it had seen this exact mindset before, many times, from many empires, including its own. The lesson China learned over thousands of years is not that power corrupts or that empires fall because of bad leaders. The lesson is simpler and far more uncomfortable. Systems fail when they stop changing at the pace reality demands. Strength becomes fragility the moment it turns into certainty. America's problem was not ignorance. The warning signs were visible. The data existed. The comparisons were obvious. But like most powerful civilizations, America believed those signs applied to others, not itself. For most empires, collapse is an abstraction, something you read about in history books, something that happens slowly to distant people under different conditions. For China, collapse is memory. Dynasties rose, peaked, fractured, and disappeared again and again. What survived was not any single system, but the habit of watching for the moment when systems stopped working. America never built that habit. From the end of World War II onward, the United States occupied a position no civilization had ever held before. It controlled the global reserve currency. It dominated the oceans. It set the rules of trade, finance, and security. Its institutions didn't just govern domestically, they structured the world itself. This wasn't just power. It was architectural power. And architecture creates a dangerous illusion. When the system works, it feels permanent, self-sustaining, automatic. For decades, American leaders interpreted success as proof that the system itself was correct. Growth validated policy. Stability validated institutions. Each crisis survived became evidence that reform was unnecessary. The system didn't need to change because it always recovered. China's historical memory would have interpreted this differently. In Chinese political thinking, long periods of stability are not proof of health. They are the most dangerous phase of the cycle. This is the moment when incentives shift from problem solving to preservation. When institutions stop asking what works and start asking what must be protected. America crossed that line quietly. The early strength of American institutions came from adaptability. Banking regulations evolved after the Great Depression. Industrial policy shifted during wartime. Social systems expanded when unrest threatened stability. The system responded to stress by changing its shape. Over time, that behavior reversed. Instead of reforming systems to fit reality, reality was bent to preserve systems. Debt was layered on instead of restructuring incentives. Financial complexity expanded instead of being simplified. Political gridlock was managed through executive workarounds rather than institutional redesign. Each solution worked in the short term. That was the trap. Chinese history is filled with warnings about this exact pattern. Dynasties didn't fail because they lacked talent or resources. They failed because success locked elites into defending arrangements that no longer match economic and social reality. The bureaucracy grew more complex as returns diminished. Military commitments expanded as cohesion weakened. Taxes increased as productivity stalled. America repeated this pattern with modern tools. The financial system became more intricate, more leveraged, more opaque. Each crisis produced new safeguards, new agencies, new rules layered on top of old ones. None of them removed complexity. They institutionalized it. Globalization followed the same path. Trade expanded faster than domestic adjustment. Supply chains stretched for efficiency, not resilience. The gains were real, but uneven. The political system responded not by redesigning the structure, but by promising that growth would eventually compensate everyone. China would have recognized this as a warning phase. In dynastic records, this is the point where officials begin reporting success upward while problems accumulate downward, where the center believes stability is being maintained because unrest has not yet turned violent, where the system is still powerful enough to suppress symptoms without addressing causes. America interpreted calm as confirmation. Economic expansions were treated as validation, even when they relied on rising debt and financialization rather than productivity. Military dominance was treated as permanence, even as conflicts grew costlier and less decisive. Political continuity was treated as resilience, even as trust eroded. None of this felt like decline. That is why it was dangerous. China's lesson is that the most decisive period is not collapse itself, but the window before collapse becomes unavoidable. That window closes not because leaders lack information, but because changing a successful system always feels more risky than preserving it. By the time symptoms become undeniable, the options are gone. America entered that window without realizing it. This is not about a single policy failure or political party. It is about a deeper assumption embedded into American thinking, that progress is linear, that innovation will always outrun constraint, that complexity is a sign of advancement rather than a cause. Chinese historical thinking treats complexity differently. Every added layer must justify its existence continuously. When returns diminish, reform is not a political embarrassment. It is a survival mechanism. America treated reform as disruption. Instead of simplifying systems, it optimized them. Instead of narrowing commitments, it expanded them. Instead of redesigning institutions, it managed around them. Each decision was rational. Together, they produce rigidity. Empires do not fail because they make mistakes. They fail because they continue making the same successful decisions long after conditions have changed. China learned this lesson the hard way. America had the opportunity to learn it by watching. It waited too long. China's historians would recognize what happened next almost immediately. After the window for easy reform begins to close, systems enter a phase where maintaining stability becomes the primary objective. Not growth, not renewal, stability. Everything is judged by whether it prevents visible disruption. This is the phase where civilizations feel strongest. The United States entered this phase gradually, without a single turning point. The Cold War ended. The rival system collapsed. There was no external pressure forcing reinvention. Instead of asking what needed to change, America asked how to lock in the arrangement that had just won. China's historical memory treats this moment with suspicion. When a dynasty defeats its rivals and faces no immediate threat, the incentive to adapt weakens. Bureaucracies shift from solving problems to protecting positions. Policies are judged by continuity rather than effectiveness. Leaders become managers of equilibrium instead of agents of change. In the American case, this showed up as institutional inertia disguised as prudence. Financial systems that once existed to support productive activity became ends in themselves. Risk was not eliminated. It was redistributed, abstracted, and hidden. Complexity increased because it allowed the system to function without confronting its own fragility. From a Chinese historical perspective, this is a classic late-stage adaptation failure. Dynastic records often describe officials responding to strain by refining mechanisms instead of questioning assumptions. When tax systems stopped producing enough revenue, rates were adjusted rather than land ownership restructured. When corruption spread, new offices were created to monitor corruption rather than simplifying authority. The appearance of control improved. The underlying problem worsened. America followed the same logic with modern tools. Economic imbalances were addressed through monetary expansion rather than structural reform. Political deadlock was bypassed through executive action rather than institutional redesign. Social fragmentation was managed through messaging and subsidies rather than resolving the conditions producing it. Each intervention worked just well enough to justify repeating it. China's lesson is that repetition is dangerous. In dynastic cycles, the moment reforms become incremental instead of transformative is the moment decline accelerates. The system is no longer adapting to reality. It is adapting to itself. America's global role intensified this effect. Because the dollar functioned as the world's reserve currency, constraints that would have forced reform on other countries arrived slowly. Deficits could expand without immediate crisis. Trade imbalances could persist without currency collapse. Financial excesses could be absorbed globally. This was interpreted as resilience. China would have interpreted it as delayed feedback. In Chinese political philosophy, delayed consequences are more dangerous than immediate ones. They create false confidence. Leaders mistake borrowed time for proof of correctness. As long as the system continues to operate, even inefficiently, reform feels optional. The United States used this time to entrench complexity. Regulatory frameworks multiplied. Financial instruments grew more abstract. Legal systems expanded to manage disputes generated by the very complexity they created. Each layer required another layer to supervise it. This is exactly the pattern Joseph Taylor described, and it mirrors Chinese dynastic experience almost perfectly. When returns on complexity decline, societies respond by adding more complexity in an attempt to recover efficiency. This works briefly, then costs accelerate faster than benefits. At that stage, systems become brittle. Brittleness is not obvious during calm periods. It reveals itself only under stress. China's dynasties learned this lesson repeatedly through floods, famines, and rebellions. The systems that looked most impressive on paper were often the ones that failed fastest when conditions shifted. America's stress test came later. Financial crises revealed how interdependent and fragile the system had become. Supply chain disruptions exposed efficiency built at the expense of resilience. Political shocks showed how little trust remained between institutions and the public. Yet even then, the response followed the same pattern. Stabilize first, reform later. Later rarely arrives. Chinese historical texts warn explicitly about this delay. Once emergency measures become permanent, reform becomes politically impossible. The system reorganizes itself around the emergency rather than resolving it. America normalized emergency governance. Temporary monetary measures became standard policy. Crisis spending became baseline spending. Exceptional interventions became expected responses. Each step reduced the system's ability to function without them. From China's perspective, this is not collapse yet. This is the pre-collapse equilibrium. It is the phase where society still feels wealthy, still appears powerful, still commands global influence, but internally has lost flexibility. Decisions narrow. Options disappear quietly. Every solution creates obligations that constrain the next decision. Chinese rulers feared this phase more than open rebellion. Rebellion at least forces change. Stability without adaptability locks decline in place. America's political culture made this worse. The belief in linear progress created the assumption that technological innovation would compensate for institutional stagnation. Problems were expected to resolve themselves through growth, efficiency, or future breakthroughs. Chinese historical thinking rejects this assumption. Innovation matters, but only if institutions can absorb it without destabilizing. When systems become too rigid, innovation increases volatility instead of resilience. America experienced this paradox. Technological advances accelerated economic concentration, disrupted labor markets, and amplified inequality faster than political systems could respond. Instead of adapting structures to match new realities, policies focused on preserving legacy arrangements. This deepened the mismatch. In dynastic terms, this is the stage where elites benefit from the system while losing the capacity to reform it. Not because they are malicious, but because reform threatens the mechanisms sustaining their position. Chinese historians describe this dynamic as fatal long before modern economics existed. Once incentives align around preservation rather than adaptation, collapse becomes a matter of timing, not possibility. America did not see this as a historical pattern. It saw it as a series of isolated challenges. That difference matters. because civilizations that understand cycles act early. Those that believe in permanence act late. America continued acting late. China's dynastic scholars pay closest attention to what happened once decline stopped being theoretical and started becoming measurable. Not collapse, measurement. This is the phase where indicators begin diverging from lived reality. Official metrics suggest stability, even improvement, while underlying strain becomes harder to ignore. Revenues still flow, armies remain funded, institutions still function, but only by consuming more resources for diminishing returns. In Chinese historical records, this stage is unmistakable. Tax registers grow thicker. Administrative reports multiply. Laws become longer, more detailed, more specific. Each rule exists to fix a problem created by the last rule. Governance becomes precise but brittle. America entered this stage without recognizing it as historical. Economic growth continued, but it relied increasingly on financial expansion rather than productivity. Employment numbers improved, but job security weakened. Asset prices rose faster than wages. The system appeared healthy by aggregate measures while becoming fragile at the margins. Chinese historians would have marked this as a warning. They observed that when systems rely on aggregates to mask dispersion, social cohesion erodes quietly. Discontent does not always show up as rebellion. It often appears first as withdrawal, lower participation, lower trust, lower belief that effort connects to outcome. This was visible. But American political culture lacked a framework for interpreting it as systemic. Instead, problems were categorized: economic issue, cultural issue, political polarization. Each treated as separate, each addressed with targeted responses that preserved the overall structure. China's historical approach treated fragmentation itself as the signal. Dynasties rarely fell because of one problem. They fell because problems multiplied faster than coordination capacity. The center could still command, but could no longer integrate. America's integration capacity weakened. The federal system struggled to reconcile national policy with regional realities. Institutions lost credibility across different social groups simultaneously. Information systems amplified disagreement faster than governance systems could respond. From a Chinese perspective, this is not chaos. It is overload. When overload sets in, leadership faces a narrowing set of choices: simplify or control, reform or enforce, reduce commitments or expand authority. Chinese dynasties experimented with all four options. The ones that survived longest chose simplification early. They consolidated institutions, cut administrative layers, rebalanced land and tax systems, accepted short-term instability to restore long-term adaptability. The ones that failed chose control. They expanded surveillance, increased enforcement, centralized authority. These measures restored order temporarily, but increased complexity and costs, accelerating collapse. America drifted toward control without naming it as such. Legal systems expanded to manage disputes generated by economic strain. Security frameworks grew to manage global commitments that no longer aligned with domestic priorities. Information management became a substitute for consensus. Each move was defensible in isolation. Together, they reduced flexibility. Chinese history warns that flexibility is the real source of power. Power without flexibility is just momentum. Momentum feels strong until it meets resistance. This is where timing matters. Chinese political philosophy places enormous emphasis on acting before resistance hardens. Once opposition becomes organized, once distrust becomes entrenched, reform costs rise exponentially. America crossed that threshold quietly. By the time systemic reform entered mainstream discussion, positions had already polarized. Any change large enough to matter threatened existing coalitions. Any delay reinforced existing imbalances. This produced paralysis. Dynastic texts described this as the freezing of the system. Officials know change is needed. The public senses decay. But no faction can move without destabilizing itself. The safest action becomes inaction. From the outside, this looks like incompetence. From the inside, it feels like inevitability. China learned to fear this phase above all others. Because once a system freezes, shocks become decisive. Shocks do not need to be catastrophic. They only need to exceed the system's remaining capacity to adapt. In dynastic China, this might have been a flood that overwhelmed neglected infrastructure, or a drought that exposed brittle food distribution systems, or a rebellion that spread faster than bureaucratic response. In modern systems, shocks take different forms. Financial dislocations, supply disruptions, demographic shifts, technological leaps, none fatal on their own. Fatal in combination, America experienced overlapping shocks. The response followed the familiar pattern: stabilize the surface, preserve the structure, defer transformation. Chinese historians would note that this response marks the final narrowing of options. Once a civilization reaches this point, adaptation becomes reactive rather than proactive. Changes occur only under pressure, and therefore at higher cost. This is when reform stops extending longevity and starts managing decline. America did not interpret its situation this way. The belief in exceptionalism reframed systemic stress as temporary turbulence. The assumption remained that innovation, markets, or leadership turnover would restore balance without altering fundamentals. Chinese historical thinking rejects this hope. Cycles do not reset automatically. They reset only through deliberate restructuring or uncontrolled collapse. The longer restructuring is delayed, the harsher the eventual adjustment. This is the core lesson embedded in thousands of years of Chinese statecraft. It is not pessimistic. It is diagnostic. America possessed the resources, knowledge, and time to act earlier. What it lacked was the mental model to recognize that success itself was the danger. The most powerful moment of any civilization is also the moment it is least capable of changing. China learned that lesson by surviving collapse. America approached it from the opposite direction, still moving, still functioning, still powerful, and increasingly constrained. Chinese history does not end its stories with drama. It ends them with recognition. Collapse, in the Chinese tradition, is not a single event. It is the moment when a system finally admits what has been true for a long time. The banners fall, the capital changes hands, the dynasty ends, but the real ending happened earlier, when adaptation stopped. That is why Chinese historians focus less on the fall itself and more on the years before it, the missed chances, the delayed reforms, the signals that were understood but not acted upon. When they look at America, they do not see a civilization suddenly failing. They see a civilization that postponed change until change became synonymous with loss. The United States did not ignore history. It studied Rome. It studied Britain. It studied the Soviet Union. What it failed to study was the common internal mechanism that linked them all. The belief that power, once achieved, could substitute for adaptation. China's lesson is that power accelerates decay if it removes urgency. This is why Chinese political thinking emphasizes discomfort, constant inspection, relentless comparison with past failures. The system is never allowed to relax into certainty because certainty is where decline begins. America built the opposite habit. Its success after World War II created confidence that its institutions were fundamentally self-correcting. Problems were framed as deviations, not warnings. Crises were treated as interruptions, not indicators. Each recovery reinforced the belief that reform could wait. Eventually, waiting became the strategy. By the time structural limits became undeniable, the cost of change had grown too large to absorb without pain. Any serious reform threatened established interests, political coalitions, and global commitments simultaneously. The system had optimized itself for continuity, not transformation. Chinese dynasties reached this point repeatedly. Some recognized it in time. They simplified. They reduced administrative layers. They rebalanced obligations. They accepted short-term instability to preserve long-term survival. Others hesitated. They doubled down on control, expanded enforcement, increased complexity. They preserved appearances while draining capacity. Those dynasties still collapse. The difference was not intelligence or morality. It was timing. America's timing slipped. Not because leaders were unaware, but because the system rewarded postponement. Growth softened pressure. Global demand absorbed imbalance. Financial mechanisms delayed consequence. Each delay made eventual adjustment sharper. From a Chinese perspective, this is the most tragic form of decline. Not sudden ruin, but preventable loss. The lesson China internalized across centuries is that survival depends on acting while strength remains. Reform after collapse is far more costly than reform before it. This is why Chinese historical thinking is cyclical rather than linear. Progress is never assumed to be permanent. Stability is never taken for granted. Every system is treated as temporary, requiring constant recalibration. Western thought, by contrast, tends to interpret history as accumulation. Knowledge builds, technology advances. Institutions improve. This creates a dangerous blind spot. It encourages the belief that modern systems have outgrown ancient constraints, that complexity is sophistication, that scale is security. China learned that scale magnifies error. The larger the system, the narrower the margin for delay. America's scale magnified everything. Its financial system amplified global shocks. Its military commitments limited flexibility. Its political polarization hardened faster because the stakes were higher. None of this guaranteed collapse. But it guaranteed that adaptation will require choices more painful than those once available. Chinese history does not claim that cycles can be escaped, only that they can be managed. A civilization can survive decline if it recognizes it early enough to reshape itself deliberately. If it waits until collapse forces change, the outcome becomes unpredictable. America reached a point where reshaping meant surrendering assumptions that had defined its identity. That growth would always outpace costs. That complexity could always be managed. That time was always available. Those assumptions were the real inheritance of power. And they proved heavier than the power itself. The Chinese lesson is not that America was destined to fail. It is that destiny is created by delay. Empires do not die because they are defeated. They die because they refuse to change while they still can. China learned this by losing everything again and again and surviving anyway. America learned it by winning. Too completely, too confidently, and too late.